The Supreme Court has just drawn a line in the sand. With a single emergency order, the justices have reignited the fight over the Second Amendment, a fight that will determine how much freedom Americans really have left. For years, states have pushed the limits of what the court has said about the right to keep and bear arms. They've passed laws that make it harder, slower, and sometimes nearly impossible for citizens to defend themselves, even after the Bruin decision made it clear that those rights are protected. But now the Supreme Court is stepping back in, and this time it's not a quiet reminder. It's a warning shot. Because this new emergency order doesn't just impact one case or one state, it could reshape the entire legal landscape for gun owners across America. Before we get into the details, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and that notifications are turned on. YouTube doesn't always like when channels talk about topics like this, and if you want to stay informed about your rights, that's the best way to do it. Also, a quick thank you to the people who continue to support independent coverage like this. You make it possible to cut through the noise and get to the truth. Now, let's talk about what's really going on here, why this emergency order matters, and what it means for every single gun owner in the country. So, here's what happened. In a move that caught legal analysts and even state officials by surprise, the Supreme Court issued an emergency order granting review to a major Second Amendment case that could overturn several of the restrictive state gun laws passed in direct response to Bruin. The case at the center of all this is Woolford versus Lopez, coming out of Hawaii. This case challenges Hawaii's new concealed carry laws, which were passed almost immediately after Bruin, in what many see as an act of defiance toward the Supreme Court's ruling. Hawaii's law, much like those in California, New York, and New Jersey, was designed to make it nearly impossible for regular citizens to carry a firearm in public, even if they had a permit. After Bruin, the Supreme Court made it clear that the Second Amendment protects the right to carry firearms outside the home for self-defense, and that states could not impose subjective standards or excessive restrictions. But Hawaii and other states responded by creating what are being called vampire laws or catch-all bans. Essentially, these laws flip the rules of public carry on their head. Instead of assuming that a person with a permit could carry a firearm unless a property owner said otherwise, these states made it illegal to carry anywhere that didn't explicitly post a sign granting permission. Think about that for a second. Under Hawaii's law, even if a business was open to the public, like a grocery store, gas station, or restaurant, you could be charged with a crime for simply walking in with your concealed firearm unless there was a sign saying you could. That's what the Woolford case is all about, and that's why this emergency order is so significant. Now, here's where things get really interesting. The lower courts in Hawaii initially ruled that the state's restrictions likely violated the Second Amendment. A federal judge even issued a preliminary injunction, saying the law was too broad and unconstitutional. But when a state appealed, the Ninth Circuit stepped in, and that's when the confusion began. The Ninth Circuit upheld Hawaii's restrictions, claiming they were more permissive than those in other states, because Hawaii allowed property owners to give either written or verbal consent to carry. At the same time, however, the same circuit court struck down California's nearly identical law, saying it violated the Second Amendment. So you had two conflicting rulings on almost the same type of law from the same circuit court. That contradiction is one of the reasons the Supreme Court got involved. When the case reached the Supreme Court, Hawaii tried to backpedal. They argued that the issue wasn't ready for review, that more evidence was needed, and that the court should kick it back to the lower courts. But here's the thing. At the Ninth Circuit, Hawaii had already told the judges there was nothing else to develop and no further evidence to gather. They said it was purely a legal question. The Supreme Court noticed that contradiction, and that's likely why they granted this emergency review. In other words, Hawaii boxed itself in. They said one thing to one court and the opposite to another, and the Supreme Court called them out. Now, the court's emergency order limits the review to one specific question: whether Hawaii's law violates the Second Amendment by presuming that all private property open to the public is off-limits to lawful concealed carry unless the owner gives express permission. That means the court is directly addressing these catch-all bans that have popped up in multiple states after Bruin. This is massive because a ruling on this issue won't just apply to Hawaii. It could set a nationwide precedent that affects laws in California, New York, New Jersey, and beyond. And this is where the fallout begins. Almost immediately after the Supreme Court issued its order, Legal teams across the country started filing motions in related cases asking to pause or reconsider proceedings until the Wolford decision comes down. Why? Because everyone knows this ruling will define how far states can go in restricting concealed carry. Continuing to litigate these other cases before the Supreme Court clarifies the standard would be a waste of time and money. Once the Wolford decision is issued, every similar case will be reinterpreted through that lens. But while gun rights advocates are celebrating, anti-gun states are already strategizing. Reports are emerging that states like Hawaii and New York are considering changes to their laws in an attempt to moot the case, meaning they might tweak or repeal their restrictions just enough to argue that the case is no longer relevant, hoping the Supreme Court will dismiss it. This tactic isn't new. In fact, New York pulled the same move a few years ago. When the Supreme Court was about to hear a challenge to one of its gun transport laws, the state quickly changed the statute, rendering the case technically moot. The court dropped it, and New York avoided a major loss, but that only delayed the inevitable. That same issue later resurfaced as the Bruen case, which ended up being a landmark victory for the Second Amendment. So, it's possible Hawaii and other states will try the same trick again, but the Supreme Court seems more prepared this time. This case will likely move forward regardless of minor changes, especially given the broader constitutional question at stake. The justices want to address this issue once and for all, because the pattern is clear. States keep passing laws that openly defy the court's previous rulings, daring them to intervene. And with this emergency order, the court is signaling that its patience is running out. What makes this development even more important is the broader legal context. Since Bruen, lower courts have been split on how to interpret the new history and tradition test for gun laws, the standard the Supreme Court created to determine whether modern regulations are consistent with the original meaning of the Second Amendment. Some courts have applied that test faithfully, striking down unconstitutional restrictions. Others, however, have twisted it, arguing that if a historical analogy can be found, no matter how distant or weak, then a modern restriction can stand. This inconsistency has created confusion nationwide, and the Supreme Court knows it has to step in to clarify the rules. Wolford versus Lopez gives them the perfect opportunity to do just that. If the court sides with the plaintiffs, as many legal experts believe they will, the decision could completely dismantle these default bans and reinforce the principle that the Second Amendment is not a second-class right. It would send a powerful message that states cannot play games with constitutional freedoms, that the right to self-defense doesn't end at a state border, and that no one should need special permission to exercise a fundamental right. On the other hand, if the court upholds Hawaii's law, it could embolden states to pass even broader restrictions, effectively allowing them to nullify the right to carry in public through technical loopholes. That's why this case is being watched so closely, not just by lawyers, but by millions of Americans who care about their rights. The implications reach far beyond gun ownership. At its core, this case is about whether states have the power to sidestep the Constitution through clever wording and procedural tricks. It's about whether the court's own authority still carries weight when states refuse to listen. And it's about whether the Supreme Court will once again reaffirm what it said in Bruen, that the Second Amendment means exactly what it says. This is why so many are calling the emergency order the most significant action on gun rights since 2022. It's not just a legal development. It's a message from the highest court in the land. Enough is enough. As the case moves forward, we'll be watching every development closely. The justices will hear arguments, review briefs, and ultimately issue a ruling that could redefine how Second Amendment cases are handled for decades to come. For gun owners, this could mark the beginning of a new era, one where constitutional rights are finally treated with the same respect as every other freedom in the Bill of Rights. And for states that have continued to defy those rulings, it could mark the end of their long-running attempt to undermine them. So, as we wait for more updates, remember this: freedom doesn't protect itself. It requires vigilance, awareness, and a willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular. The Supreme Court's emergency order is a reminder that the Constitution still matters and that when pushed too far, even the highest court will step in to defend it. This story is far from over, and the fallout from this decision will reach every corner of the country. Stay tuned, because we'll be here to break it all down as it unfolds. And as always, thank you for watching, for supporting, and for standing for the values that built this nation. Because as history has shown, this country was built by free men, protected by armed citizens, and it will be maintained by those who refuse to let freedom fade.